sometimes the hardest part isn't the battle, it's the silence. Not because silence is empty, but because silence has a way of making us question everything. Have you ever prayed for something with all your
Come here,
heart,
little one.
believed that God heard you, and then watched day
You are
after
safe
day
now,
pass
little
as if
lamb.
heaven had forgotten your name? At first, you're full of faith. You tell yourself to be patient. You quote the promises. You keep showing up. But then something begins to change. Not around you, inside you. You stop asking, when will God answer? And you quietly begin asking, why did I hear him wrong? Because waiting has a strange effect on the human heart. It doesn't just test your patience, it tests your identity. It makes you question whether you were foolish for believing, whether you imagined God's voice, whether the dream was ever real. What's difficult isn't simply waiting. It's watching other people's lives move forward while yours seems frozen. You celebrate their victories. You smile. You say you're happy for them. But deep inside, you wonder why your own story feels stuck, and that question becomes heavier every day. If God chose me, why does my life still look so ordinary? Maybe you've never said those exact words, but you've felt them. Because there comes a moment when the greatest temptation isn't to stop believing in God. It's to believe that God has stopped working. That's the lie waiting whispers into every heart. It tells you that because nothing is changing, nothing is happening. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the greatest work God ever does is the work nobody can see? What if heaven is never more active than when earth feels completely silent? There was a young man who understood that pain long before he ever understood the reason for it. His name was David. Most people remember him standing before Goliath. Few remember where God left him before that day. Not on a throne, not in a palace, not in front of crowds, but alone, in empty fields, surrounded by sheep, day after day, night after night. Imagine what that looked like. The wind moving through the grass, the silence stretching for hours, no applause, no recognition, no evidence that his life was moving toward anything extraordinary, just another sunrise, another flock, another ordinary day. If someone had walked past David during those years, they wouldn't have seen Israel's future king. They would have seen a forgotten shepherd. And maybe that's exactly how you feel today. Like everyone else sees an ordinary person, while you're desperately hoping God still sees something more. But here's what no one around David could see. Those fields weren't empty. They were classrooms. Every ordinary day was teaching him something a palace never could. Responsibility, faithfulness, courage, dependence. Not because God had forgotten his promise, but because God was quietly building the man who would one day carry it. But here's something almost nobody talks about. David wasn't simply waiting for a throne. He was becoming someone who could survive one. Because receiving a blessing before you're ready isn't mercy, it's destruction. Think about it. What kind of king would David have become if God had taken him straight from the anointing to the palace? A young man with a crown, but without endurance, authority, without humility, power, without the character to carry it. God loved David too much to let that happen. So instead of changing David's circumstances, he started changing David. Every lonely night under the stars, God was teaching him to be comfortable with an audience of one. Every sheep that wandered away was teaching him responsibility for lives that couldn't repay him. Every ordinary morning was quietly killing the desire to chase significance through people's approval. Because obscurity has a purpose. It exposes the parts of us that only wanted the promise because other people would finally notice us. That's why waiting hurts so much. It doesn't only reveal God's timing, it reveals our motives, and that's uncomfortable. Because sometimes we're asking God for the destination while He's trying to transform the traveler. Maybe that's why your prayers seem unanswered. Not because heaven is ignoring you, but because heaven is answering a deeper prayer than the one you're praying. You're asking for the promotion. God is building integrity. You're asking for the relationship. God is healing the wounds that would destroy it. You're asking for influence. God is teaching you how to remain humble when people finally start listening. From our perspective, nothing is happening. From God's perspective, everything that matters is happening first. And then, something happened that changed David forever. A lion appeared. Not in front of an army, not in front of a crowd. No songs would be written about that moment. No one would even know it happened. It was just David, a terrified flock, and a predator that had no idea it had walked into God's classroom. Imagine the fear. Imagine hearing the sheep scatter. Imagine watching a lion carry one away. David had a choice. He could tell himself, "It's only one sheep. No one will know. This isn't worth risking my life." But he didn't. He ran toward the danger, not because anyone was watching, because faithfulness had already become part of who he was. And that may be one of the greatest lessons hidden in David's story. Character isn't revealed when people are watching. Character is revealed when nobody would blame you for walking away. David fought that lion not to become king. He fought that lion because he had already decided the kind of man he wanted to be. Long before he ever wore a crown, and years later, when the entire nation saw him standing before Goliath, they called him brave. But heaven had seen that bravery long before anyone else did. Goliath wasn't where David learned courage. Goliath was where courage became visible. But the wilderness wasn't finished with David, because one victory wasn't enough. Soon after the lion came a bear. Another battle. Another ordinary day. Another fight no one would ever celebrate. And that's interesting, because when we imagine preparation, we usually picture God teaching us through one big moment. But God often teaches through repetition. The same kind of day, the same kind of struggle, the same unanswered prayer, again and again and again. Have you noticed how life sometimes feels like that? You think you've learned patience, and then another delay comes. You think you've overcome fear, and another impossible situation appears. You think you've finally grown, and suddenly you're facing another battle that looks strangely familiar. It's easy to think you've failed. Maybe God is simply strengthening the same muscle. Every repetition was giving David something he couldn't see. Not confidence in himself, confidence in the God who kept showing up. That's an important difference. Self-confidence disappears the moment you face something bigger than yourself. Confidence in God grows every time He carries you through something you couldn't survive alone. David wasn't collecting victories. He was collecting evidence. Evidence that God had never abandoned him. Evidence that God could be trusted. Evidence that tomorrow didn't have to be feared because yesterday had already proven God's faithfulness. Years later, when everyone else saw Goliath, David saw something completely different. He wasn't comparing the giant to himself. He was comparing the giant to every moment God had already carried him through. That's why fear didn't speak louder than faith. His memories did. Maybe that's why God allows us to remember certain seasons long after they've ended. Not to relive the pain, but to remember His faithfulness. Because one day, your biggest battle won't be won by what you know. It will be won by what you've already lived with God. And maybe that's where you are today. Looking at a giant that seems impossible. A diagnosis. A broken relationship. A financial burden. A prayer that feels unanswered. A future you can no longer imagine. Everyone around you is measuring the size of the problem. God is looking at something completely different. He's looking at the years He has already spent preparing you. The conversations nobody heard. The tears nobody saw. The prayers nobody answered but Him. The quiet victories that never appeared on social media. The mornings you got out of bed when you wanted to quit. The nights you stayed faithful when giving up would have been easier. None of those moments were wasted, because God has never confused hidden with meaningless. The world celebrates what happens in public. God transforms people in private. And maybe that's why the waiting has lasted longer than you expected. Not because God enjoys making you wait, but because He refuses to send you into tomorrow carrying the version of yourself that belongs to yesterday. One day, David finally stood in front of Goliath. and everyone thought that was the beginning of his story. It wasn't. It was simply the first chapter the world was allowed to see. But even then, the throne didn't come. If we're honest, that's the part of David's story we usually skip. Because we love the victory over Goliath, we love the songs, we love the celebration, we love watching God open a door. But what happens when the door opens, and you're still not where you thought you'd be? David became a national hero overnight. People sang his name. The future finally seemed close. If there was ever a moment to believe the waiting was over, this was it. But instead of receiving the crown, he received a spear. Saul became jealous. The same King David, faithfully served, became the man trying to kill him. Can you imagine how confusing that must have been? God, I obeyed you. I trusted you. I fought the giant. So why is my life becoming harder instead of easier? Maybe you've asked those same questions. Maybe you thought obeying God would remove the struggle, only to discover it introduced a different one. Sometimes we expect God's favor to look like comfort. David discovered that God's favor often looks like preparation. Because while Saul was throwing spears, God was removing something far more dangerous than those weapons: pride, impatience, the desire to force God's promises with human hands. David had opportunities to end the waiting himself. Twice. He stood close enough to Saul to take the throne in a single moment. One decision, one swing of a sword, one shortcut. No more running, no more caves, no more fear. Would anyone have blamed him? Probably not. Most people would have called it justice. Some would have even called it God's provision. But David saw something everyone else missed. There is a difference between an opportunity and God's timing. He refused to become the wrong man just to arrive at the right destination. Think about how rare that is. Our world tells us to take every opportunity. Protect yourself, promote yourself, force the outcome, make it happen. David chose something far more difficult. He trusted God enough to leave the outcome in God's hands. And maybe that's the hardest kind of faith. Not believing that God can do something, believing He will, without feeling the need to control how or when. That's where waiting becomes worship. Not because it feels good, but because every day you refuse to manipulate the promise. You're telling God, I trust your hands more than mine. The caves became David's home, cold, dark, hidden, far away from everything he thought his life was supposed to become. If someone had looked inside one of those caves, they would have seen a fugitive. God saw a king almost ready, because caves have a way of removing every false identity. Titles disappear, recognition disappears, comfort disappears. You're left with one question. If everything God promised took longer than I expected, would I still love Him? That's not a question you answer with words. You answer it with your life. And maybe that's the question your own season is asking today. Not whether your faith is real when the prayers are answered, but whether your faith is still real when all you have is the promise. Because here's what I've learned. God is not only preparing the blessing for you. Sometimes He's preparing you for the blessing. And those are not the same thing. And then, after years of running, after years of hiding, after years of wondering if the promise would ever become reality, David finally became king. But if you think this story ends with a crown, you've missed its greatest lesson. Because the throne was never God's greatest gift to David. The man David had become was. The world looked at the crown. God looked at the heart. Think back for a moment. The shepherd who learned responsibility when no one cared. The young man who worshipped when nobody applauded. The lonely fighter who faced lions and bears with no audience. The servant who refused to take shortcuts. The fugitive who kept honoring God while living in caves. Every season looked unrelated, random, painful, delayed. But when you step back, you realize none of it was random. God wasn't writing separate stories. He was writing one story, from a perspective only he could see. And maybe that's what you're struggling to believe today, because you're trying to understand your life chapter by chapter. God is looking at the finished book. You see interruptions. He sees connections. You see delays. He sees development. You see silence. He sees construction. Maybe that's why Ecclesiastes says that God makes everything beautiful in its time. Not our time, His. Because His timing isn't just about arriving at the right moment. It's about becoming the right person before the moment arrives. What if that's what your waiting has really been about? What if this season wasn't designed to punish you, but to prepare you? What if the prayer you think God hasn't answered is actually being answered in a way you cannot yet recognize? Maybe while you've been asking Him to change your circumstances, He's been healing your heart. Maybe while you've been asking for open doors, He's been building the strength you'll need after those doors open. Maybe while you've been asking for the next chapter, He's been making sure this chapter produces everything it was meant to produce. One day, David looked back and could finally understand. The sheep, the wilderness, the loneliness, the lion, the bear, Goliath, the palace, the spears, the caves. None of it had been wasted. Not one tear, not one lonely night, not one unanswered question. Because God has never been in the business of wasting seasons, and He hasn't started with yours. So if your life feels quiet today, don't confuse quiet with empty. If heaven feels silent, don't confuse silence with absence. And if you're still waiting, don't confuse waiting with being forgotten, because the same God who was shaping David in places no one valued is still shaping people in hidden places today, including you. One day, you may look back on this season and realize something that feels impossible to believe right now. The greatest miracle wasn't what God eventually gave you. The greatest miracle was who you became while you were waiting. If this message encouraged you and reminded you that God is still working even when you can't see it, subscribe to the channel and join our Made for More family. There are many more stories waiting to remind you that God is never finished with the people who trust Him. And if someone came to your mind while you were listening, share this video with them. It might be the encouragement they have been praying for. Until next time, keep trusting God because He is still writing your story.